Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here, coming to you once again from the mobile BCG headquarters at the camper here. And this is video 2 of my Z6iii setup guide series, and this is going to cover the photo shooting menu. As before, I want to remind you that this is just a very basic setup video. The setup guide that's coming out probably in September that I'm writing for wildlife photography is going to have so much more information. Not only is it going to dive deeper into each one of these topics that we're about to discuss, but it also is going to give you more hows and whys and alternative ideas. So maybe you don't want to set it this way, and here's another reason why you might want to set it a different way. So all of that kind of stuff is going to be covered in there. So if you like this video, it's just really scratching the surface of what's going to be in that book. So make sure you check that book out if it's, available when you're watching this video, or if it's not, make sure you stop by the site and sign up for the free email newsletter so you're alerted as soon as that book is published. And once again, the links for the other videos are down there in the description area. Let's jump in. Okay, so to get to the photo shooting menu, once again, we're going to press the menu button on the back of the camera. And we're going to go up to the little green icon for the camera there, highlight it yellow. And when we jump down here, our first option in the photo shooting menu is to reset it. So you're going to want to look at that. If you've ever gotten to the point where it's just such a mess, you don't know what to do, hit the reset, start over. Most of the time you don't do that. I've never done that, I don't think. But anyhow, moving on, I don't do anything with the storage folder. File naming, I do change this. We have DSC there, and that is basically the first 3 letters in front of the file name there. So I'm going to click that, and I'm going to change that to something more descriptive. So what I like to do is I like each of my cameras to have its own little unique name, especially if I have more than one of them. So if I had a pair of these, maybe I'd call this Z6A and the other one Z6B. And the reason for that is because I want to be able to look at the file name. So if I have a problem, maybe I have a big old glob of dust on my sensor, and I'm shooting both these cameras back and forth, I would know exactly whether it was Z6A or Z6B that was giving me the problems. In this case, I only have the one, but I'm still going to rename it to Z6iii, hit OK, and call it good. Moving on, primary slot selection, we have the CF Express XQD slot as the default, which is the one you want. That's your good one. That's that nice fast CF Express card that hopefully you bought for your camera. Again, I like the Delkins myself. The Delkin Blacks are really good. I'm not associated with them. I just like them. And for the most part, I think you should just leave this alone. One place I do see people get into problems here, though, is if they happen to be doing a firmware update. Sometimes they'll be like, oh, I have an old SD card. I'll put the firmware in there, pop it in the camera, and then suddenly they can't find the update file. They go to update their firmware, and there's nothing there. It doesn't work. And the reason is the camera looks in the primary slot. So in that particular case, you might want to come in, set it to the SD card slot. But I think for everything else, as long as you're using CF Express cards, you should go ahead and leave it set to CF Express. And honestly, even if you're not using CF Express cards and that slot is empty, then it'll just use the SD card slot anyway, so it doesn't matter. So CF Express then. Secondary slot function. Now this is your second one here. In this case, that's my SD card slot, and this is set to overflow, and that's where I'm going to keep it. Basically what that means is if I fill up my CF Express card, it's going to overflow and keep shooting and keep writing to the SD card. Now there's obviously other options. We can back up, we can do raw primary, JPEG secondary, etc., etc. And I do talk about these in the guide, in the upcoming guide. I have everything you need to know about all of these and pros, cons, all that stuff. But for most people, I think we end up kind of landing on overflow. So I'm going to set that right like that. Image area, for the most part, you're going to want FX. You can technically come into this menu, though, this sub-menu here, by hitting the right side of the multi-selector, and you can select any of these that you want. FX is really where you want to be. If you want to choose a different image area, we have an option that we're going to put in video 4. It's going to be under the I menu, so you can just go in there and change it if you want. So I leave that at FX in here. Go back here, though, for a second, because there is something important I want to show you, and that is the DX crop alert. I highly recommend you turn that on. We have multiple ways to get into DX mode. We can either choose it like through the I menu or something. We could choose it through this menu, or this camera also allows you to set a button so you can toggle between FX and DX. So if you want to kind of on the fly be able to jump into DX crop mode and kind of get that closer field of view, you can do it. But the problem is it's easy to accidentally brush those buttons, and it's easy to forget if you've set in DX mode for something else. And what this is going to do is it's going to flash a little DX indicator up in the viewfinder for you so that you can see that you are in DX mode, and hey, maybe you have a problem, because there's no other indication that you're in DX mode, because the camera, it's not like a DSLR where drew a great outline for you. Instead, the camera just zooms into the DX area, and since it's the same proportions, you don't notice that you're in DX mode, and it's very easy to spend an afternoon shooting in DX mode and not realize it if you don't have this on. So make sure you do. Turn that on. Hit menu to get back out. Next, we have tone mode. We have SDR and HLG. For most people, 99% of people right now, SDR is still the way to go. HLG is more if you intend to use these images on really high, wide color gamut monitors and true HDR stuff. And SDR is really what we want for photography most of the time. Now, as time goes on, this might change, and I do cover this extensively in the setup guide, but for right now, my recommendation is SDR. Then we go to image quality. Now we have a lot of options. We have JPEGs and HEIFs and all that stuff. Now, one thing that confuses people is like, why is it JPEG/HEIF? How do I select that? You don't. You select that by selecting SDR or HLG in the previous menu. If you selected wow, too many letters. If you selected SDR, you'll get JPEGs. If you selected HLG, you'll get HEIF files. And we have the normal things. We have the standard ones. Then we have the ones with the star that are a little better quality. Those are the ones I would recommend. And we can go up here and we can have raw plus those. What I recommend doing though is, as a surprise to no one who watches any of my videos, I just shoot raw. I don't do any of the other stuff. Just raw straight up. This middle one right here, boom, raw, you're done. If you're doing wildlife, I think that's the way to go. It gives you the most flexibility when it comes time to post-process, because let's face it, sometimes we get into situations with our wildlife and it's a little bit tricky. Raw recording. This one is going to vary depending on when you're watching this video. Right now, because this is a new camera and there's not a ton of profiles out there with third-party raw processing packages, I recommend just going lossless compression. I think that's the easiest one. I think that's the safest one. As time goes on, I'd say high efficiency is great. I use it all the time in my Z8 and Z9. But right now at launch, I am concerned a little bit about how many programs are supporting high efficiency. So right now I'm just using lossless compression. I mean, 24 megapixel, we're not really talking huge files here anyway. Next we have ISO sensitivity settings. And I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to leave them alone. Now some people will want to set their maximum sensitivity as something else, but I just leave it alone anymore. It doesn't really matter, because here's what happens. If you have this set to say 12,800 and you say, hey, that's my maximum, I'm not going any higher than that. That sounds good in theory, but the problem is the camera's not going to like stop shooting or something if you hit that cap where you need more light. If you're using auto ISO, especially like I do with manual plus auto ISO, if that's your auto exposure mode like it is for me, if that's how you're set up, and I bet most of you are, what's going to happen is if you hit that ISO cap that you set in here, say 12,800, but you needed another stop or two, the camera's just going to underexpose. It's still going to shoot. It's just going to underexpose by a stop or two. That's all that's going to happen. So what's going to happen, if you want to use those images, then you're going to go into Lightroom or whatever raw processor you use. You're going to jack up the exposure, and guess what? It's going to look just like you would use a much higher ISO in camera. So it doesn't really matter. You're going to get the same result. So I just leave it at the default. And what I try to do is I try to be much more responsible. I've gotten really good at it over the years, finally. It takes practice. But I watch my ISO levels. Every time I bring this camera up to my eye, I'm looking at where my ISO is. You have to take responsibility for your ISO if you're using auto ISO, or if you're using, especially if you're using rather, manual plus auto ISO. You have to take a look at that ISO every time you bring the camera to your viewfinder. And when you do that, it doesn't matter where you set this, because you're going to notice it. You're going to say, oh, wait, I'm at ISO 25,600, or I'm at 32,000 ISO or whatever. Maybe that's a little too high. So then you adjust your settings, say, okay, maybe less shutter speed. Maybe I need to open the lens up, whatever, to get down to something more reasonable. So I think that's the main lesson here. So that's why I just leave it alone. White balance, I like natural light auto for wildlife and nature photography in general. I think it looks very good. So that's how I set this. Picture control, I usually just go to auto or standard. It's fine. There's a lot of other options in here, and I discussed some of these in the book, but for the most part, I think auto or standard is just absolutely fine for wildlife work, or for pretty much any kind of work you do. I don't use picture controls. Color space is fine. A lot of people wonder about sRGB versus Adobe RGB. I leave it in sRGB because I think that that is absolutely adequate for most of what we're doing, and it doesn't really matter if you're shooting RAW, because once you get to your computer, it'll probably put it in like ProPhoto or something, color space. So this is just basically all this is going to do for a RAW shooter is set the color space for the JPEG in the camera. And I'm not 100% confident that this little LCD panel back here can even display like the full Adobe RGB gamut anyway, so I leave it in sRGB. Active D-lighting I don't really worry about. I kind of think of that as more of a JPEG setting. Now, long exposure noise reduction, I tend to turn that on, but it's not really a wildlife setting. So this is maybe a little bonus if you're a landscape shooter. What this will do is, if you have a longer exposure, let's say, I don't know, 5 seconds, and if you've ever used this, what happens, you've seen it before. You take it, and it'll spend 5 seconds taking the exposure, then it'll spend another 5 seconds processing the image. So basically what it's doing is it'll take a dark slide during that other 5 seconds. Then it can compare the noise in that dark slide to the noise you got in your actual image, and it's a really cool noise reduction strategy that can work really well. Obviously not applicable to wildlife unless you can get an animal to sit for 5, 10, 15 seconds, whatever, but for landscape work, it's kind of cool. Now, high ISO noise reduction is more of a JPEG setting, and not that I really worry about. Same with vignette control, diffraction compensation. Any of these, if you're using Capture NX Studio and you have this set, it'll apply those. Third-party RAW processors are all over the place. Some of them do, some of them don't. But pretty much anything that you're seeing, like with active D-lighting or high ISO noise reduction or vignette control or stuff like that, you can do the same kind of thing in Lightroom without, or any third-party RAW processor without having to set it here. So I just kind of ignore those settings. Moving down, we have some flicker reduction and high frequency flicker reduction options here if you're shooting under lights that tend to flicker, like fluorescence and things like that. One thing though I do want to note, high frequency flicker reduction, if you turn this on, you'll get some shutter speed fine tuning. And I've had people email me before and say they're getting like their normal shutter speeds and everything in between. So they're like, I have 1/250th, I have 1/251, 1/252, 1/253, on and on and on. And if you ever find your shutter speeds acting weird like that, where you're getting pretty much every option available, come in here and turn this off. That'll fix it for you. Next, we have metering. Most of the time I'm using matrix metering, sometimes spot. A lot of times highlight weighted metering, especially if I'm using like manual with auto ISO. Maybe the scenario is I have like an egret, a white egret, a great egret flying in front of some dark background. Highlight weighted metering works really well in that scenario to keep it from clipping. But of course, if he flies against the sky, then it really underexposes. So you got to kind of balance it out or shoot manual, whatever works. But I set this through the I menu. I don't come in here to the photo shooting menu to do it, but I just wanted to let you know it was there and give you a little advice there. I don't use flash, so we're going to skip right past release mode. I like continuous high extended, as I've said in my other videos. This is the 20 frames per second. It does give you a little bit of a slideshow, but it is really hard to detect. It took me a couple hours to figure out I was actually looking at a slideshow. So continuous high extended, that's the electronic shutter. If you are using the mechanical shutter, you're going to be at 14 frames a second, but I like the continuous high extended electronic shutter option for most subjects. I have managed to get some rolling shutter, though, since I've had this loaner from Nikon. So you definitely, if you have a bird that's really flapping its wings fast or moving fast, you definitely can see a little rolling shutter. So that's where you want to go to that mechanical shutter. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. Focus mode, AFS. We are going to go to AFC. AFC is my preferred one for wildlife photography. And the reason for that is simple. AFS is going to focus at a specific distance, and once it locks on, it's done focusing. It's not going to continue to do it unless you reinitiate focus. So if you, say, lock on to a deer, and that deer goes like this and leans forward, you know what's going to happen? It's not going to follow the eye. The focus is going to stay back here, and his eye is going to be completely out. If you're an AFC, and if you have AF engaged, you have to keep autofocus engaged, either with a half press of the shutter release or pressing the back button, whichever strategy you use. But as long as focus is engaged and that AF points on the eye, as that animal moves forward, the focus will follow that eye and stay nice and sharp for you. So I leave that in AFC all the time for wildlife. Next, we have AF area modes, and if we click it, we unsurprisingly get to a menu that allows us to set an AF area. Now, unfortunately, I think this is about the least efficient way to do this. I programmed my video record button for it. I'll show you that in video 4. But let's talk about this just briefly since we're here. Now, the first thing I want to say is that in order to get the most out of your AF system, you really need to know when to use each one of these, when not to use them, how to use them, why to use them, what to use them for, when one works better than another for a given scenario, and all that stuff. And unfortunately, this video is just not meant for something like that. But the guidebook is, so make sure you check that out because it's going to show you all of that good stuff. And in fact, one of the problems I see with Nikon shooters a lot is that they're not getting the sharpness that they expect or the autofocus performance that they expect. And a lot of times, it's simply because they're using the wrong AF areas or using the AF area improperly. So, just some food for thought there. If you're considering the guide, it'll help out quite a bit. But there is something here I do want to show you. So not only can we select our AF areas, but we can also select the size of our wide AF areas. Now, we have C1 and C2. Those are the two that are customizable. Now, if we go in here, we can see that we have a custom AF area. It by default looks like this. I was playing with it, but I like these a little bit shorter like this, and I like this horizontal bar one. I've been actually kind of getting into this one lately. I like this configuration because sometimes you have an animal that's just over grass. Maybe its head is over grass, or maybe there's a bird flying over grass, something like that. And you can position this so that it's on the head and it's missing the grass, so the camera's not locking onto the wrong thing. This is really handy. So I'm going to leave that as it is. We have C2 we can also program. Now, one thing that I do like with C2 sometimes is to make a single AF point. Now, that sounds redundant since I already have a single AF point, right? But the interesting thing with this one is that this single AF point supports subject detection. Normal single point AF does not support subject detection, not at all. But wide areas do, even if they're in the form of a little single point. So this allows you to kind of get the AF point kind of close to the eye, but if the animal's moving around a little bit, and subject detection sees it, that's the critical part. But if the animal's moving around a little bit, a little single point wide AF area will also kind of follow that a little bit around. So it's not going to go all over the animal. So you can't put this little dot on its butt and think that it's going to get on the eye. But if you're around the eye and he moves a little bit, it might stick with it for you. So that kind of comes in handy sometimes too. So anyhow, I'm going to hit OK, and let's move on. So anyhow, moving on. We also have subject detection, and we're going to pick animal for wildlife. And there was some confusion with some of the press materials that came out because Nikon says, it detects birds, and people said, oh, look, it has bird detection. It does not have dedicated bird detection, though. It can detect birds. Those are two different things. So animal covers mammals and birds. So if you in animal, it'll cover both, but it doesn't cover like every animal or every bird for that matter. For the most part, it does really well with birds, but with animals and mammals and things like that, sometimes it gets it, sometimes it doesn't. Technically speaking, it's designed for cats and dogs, but it does see other things. But if you look at Nikon's literature, it doesn't say cats, dogs, and gazelles or something. It's like cats, dogs, birds. But that's pretty much what Nikon is more or less promising that will work. The rest of it's just kind of a bonus. Manual focus subject detection area. I do like to have this on. I put it to all. And for example, the way this works is, let's say you're in wide AF and you want to go to manual focus, or you're just manual focus overriding. What this will do, it'll still use the subject detection areas. If it detects the subject, that's the critical part. If it doesn't recognize the subject, it's not going to work. But as long as it recognizes the subject, it'll draw a little white box around the eye, and then you can focus. And as you focus, if you get critical focus, if you get the focus correct, what it'll do is it'll turn that little white box to green, which is really handy if you're dealing with an animal that's kind of difficult to focus on because there's maybe blowing grass and you're manually focusing, and you can kind of just dial it in and get it exactly perfect there in manual focus where autofocus wasn't really working well for you. So I do like to have that on. Vibration reduction, I use sport instead of normal, but I do think normal maybe gives you a little bit of an edge, especially at slower shutter speeds. The disadvantage with normal, though, is that it makes the viewfinder jump a little bit. So if you're out there shooting and your viewfinder's like bouncing all over the place, it makes it a little more difficult, especially if you're trying to put like a single AF point like on an eye or something, and it's up here, down here, up here, every shot. It's like, am I on the eye or am I not on the eye? So I like to use sport most of the time because it eliminates that. But again, if I'm in a lower light situation, I'm really pushing shutter speeds down, and I need every ounce that I can get, I use this. I still think sport's like 90% of what the stabilization you get with normal. But for most of the time, normal. But if you get into a situation and sport's not really cutting it, it's too slow of a shutter speed, try normal, see how it goes. Link VR to focus point, recommend leaving that on. Basically what that's going to do, that's a neat little Nikon technology where it'll center the VR stabilization around the focus point, especially on the sensor itself there. So it does help you get a little bit more performance from your VR, a little better results from your VR. So I do recommend leaving that on. I don't do auto bracketing, multiple exposure, HDR overlays. None of this stuff is really relevant for me as far as wildlife. I doubt it's relevant for you either. I do some focus shift shooting, but that is way too complex to do in a little video like this. And there's not really any settings in here that you do. You kind of set this up as you go. I do have a full video course on how to use focus shift shooting if you wanted to investigate that. I have that on my website. And I think it's like 4 hours long. It takes you from start to finish. like even through post-processing. So that's why I'm not going into it here in this video. It's too much. And I don't use much pixel shift shooting with wildlife. I think it would be cool, but I also think it would be cool if wildlife was to stay still, and they don't. So, that's where we are. So that wraps up the photo shooting menu, our basic quick little setup guide for it here, our video setup guide. And again, my regular setup guide will go into much, much more detail for you. And I hope you'll stick with me into video 3. But if not, and if you're on your way out, have a great day. And either way, have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. We'll catch you later.